Hello, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 234, Destroying Amarna and Splitting Heirs. One day, during the reign of Ramesses II, a team of royal workers came to the city of Akhet-Aten, the horizon of the sun disk, constructed for the ruler Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti. The town was a sprawling mass of temples, palaces, suburbs, and tombs. At least, it had been, for a brief period around 1350 BCE. Now, several decades later, Akhet-Aten languished in obscurity. A small population, perhaps, made their homes on the floodplain. The temples to Aten, though, no longer operated. The great palaces and the suburbs were the home of birds and rodents rather than people. Still, Akhet-Aten had one last purpose. Sometime in Ramesses' reign, a fleet of transport barges tied up at the east bank of the river. Royal overseers disembarked along with dozens, probably hundreds of workers. They unloaded equipment, including chisels, hammers, wooden sleds, and pieces of scaffolding. The laborers arrived at Akhet-Aten to do work. Not building work, but unbuilding. They were here to deconstruct Akhenaten's city. Masons fanned out among the monuments. The two magnificent sanctuaries that we know as the Great and Small Aten temples were target number one. Then there was the Grand Palace and administrative buildings in the city center. The workers were not interested in the mud brick structures, houses, outbuildings, and so forth. They wanted the stone. Erecting scaffolding around the temples, they clambered up the walls. Using their small chisels, they broke the mortar between layers of stone bricks. Extracting them one by one, the masons lowered those bricks to the ground and carried them to the boats. That was easier than it sounds. When Akhenaten commissioned his monuments, he favored speed over scale. As a result, most of that king's monuments are made of stone blocks much smaller than average. Historians know them as talatat. They're usually about 54 centimeters long, or 21 inches. Still sizable, but small enough for a man to carry on his shoulder. Using that smaller brick had hastened Akhenaten's constructions. Now it accelerated the demolition. The workers did their jobs carefully. This was not a wanton ransacking or destruction of the city. Had they come in hatred or anger, they might have smashed buildings to pieces, leaving behind piles of rubble. That was not the case. Instead, the workers did their job methodically. They dismantled the walls brick by brick and took those away for reuse. Soon, the great barges departed Akhet-Aten, carrying the talatat on their decks. They were not going far, just a few miles downriver, to a town called Hemenu, better known today as Hermopolis. This was an ancient community, sacred to the god Jehote or Thoth, and King Ramesses II had plans for a new temple at the site. The talatat were going there. In the 1930s, a German archaeological project excavated the temple at Hermopolis. Lo and behold, many of the larger structures, like the pylon towers and the main walls, had talatat blocks embedded in their cores. The ancient builders had used the remains of Akhenaten's city as filler material to strengthen their new constructions. Ironically, and fortunately for history, that reuse preserved many of the blocks. Many of these talatat were decorated, and when they were extracted from the temple at Hermopolis, archaeologists were confronted with a vast jigsaw puzzle, thousands of pieces containing tiny traces of Akhenaten's art. That being said, some of the blocks were damaged. Select sections, mainly images of Akhenaten himself, had been erased by ancient vandals. Unfortunately, we don't know who caused that damage. It could have been Ramesses' workers, on the orders of Pharaoh, or it could have happened earlier under his father Seti, or even Horemheb or Tutankhamun. The ancient Vandals did not sign their desecrations with a date, so it remains speculative, awaiting further study. What we can say is that the erasures were not thorough. While many of Akhenaten's images were damaged, along with his cartouches, there were still plenty of scenes left only partially damaged, or even intact. Most notably, depictions of the Aten, the solar disk who was the supreme god of that era, they were totally fine. So were the figures of Nefertiti and the princesses of Amarna. It seems that whoever attacked these talatat had no particular issue with the queen or the god. They disliked Akhenaten specifically. That pattern might give us a clue to the culprits. You see, around the same time that workers were deconstructing Amarna, another Egyptian had a problem with that heretic pharaoh. It was serious enough to involve a court case. In the early reign of Ramesses II, a man named Mes, or Mose, was embroiled in a lawsuit. Allegedly, someone had stolen land belonging to his family. It had been in their clan for centuries, going all the way back to the start of the 18th dynasty. Now, Mes was trying to get the deed to that property back. In the process, he appealed to higher officials. He had gone to the government archives, and even called witnesses regarding the land. Mes recorded this lawsuit on the walls of his tomb. As he did so, he made a curious reference. When the witnesses came forward, one of them described events, or at least records, taking place in the time of Akhenaten, but they didn't call the pharaoh by name. Instead, they referenced this event as being, quote, in the time of the enemy of Akhet-Aten. The phrase he used was pa-heru, that can mean enemy, rebel, or even the fallen one, which sounds pretty cool. The point is, someone involved in a court case needed to refer to the reign of Akhenaten, but they didn't even want to name that king. This kind of cultural hostility might give some context to the demolition of Amarna. Again though, the talatat recovered from Hermopolis showed some damage to the king's figure and name, but the erasures were haphazard, unsystematic. They also did not attack Aten or Nefertiti or the princesses. Whatever the rage was, it was directed mainly at the king. With that in mind, Egyptologists remain divided on the motivations for destroying Amarna. In the 20th century, scholars like Pendlebury, Hari, and Aldred saw it as a vengeful project driven by hatred of the heretic pharaoh, quote-unquote. Similarly, Nicholas Reeves, in his book Akhenaten, Egypt's False Prophet, goes even further. He suggested, quote, the foundations of the great Aten temple at Amarna were finally cemented over, to seal in, as it were, the infection of the cursed spot. That's an extreme view, going a bit far beyond the archaeological record, but you see the tone of some historical interpretations. On the other side, there is a more pragmatic view. Archaeologist Barry Kemp, who led excavations at Amarna for decades, noted how, quote, half-hearted many of the erasures were. He also pointed out how some monuments, like Akhenaten's boundary stelae, were left completely alone, despite being highly visible and easy to access. Similarly, a German scholar named Rainer Hanke, who studied the talatat blocks from Hermopolis, noted how, at Amarna, the demolition was systematic and clean. There were no piles of rubble smashed up from angry vandals. The Ramessid workers did not obliterate Amarna, they had simply unbuilt it. In this view, Amarna was not necessarily cursed ground, but more like a quarry of unusually accessible stone. Personally, I find the pragmatic view slightly more convincing. For one thing, it's largely based on the archaeology of Amarna and the damage to the talatat, treating it almost like an ancient crime scene. It's not a crime of passion, but rather a crime of opportunity, carried out systematically and methodically. While there was clearly hostility to Akhenaten as a man and a ruler, and folks were all too happy to forget that unfortunate period, the demolition of Amarna was probably just a practical affair. The stone was there, but the temples weren't operating, so let's take it away and put it to good use. On current evidence, I think that's the more likely scenario. Anyway, in the reign of Ramesses II, workers deconstructed the royal monuments at Akhet-Aten. Removing the talatat blocks, they loaded them on transport ships and carried them away. As a result, much of the art of Amarna survived, although reused in new structures. The city, meanwhile, began to crumble to dust. For our story, Amarna is now gone. By 1243 BCE, regnal year 50, the king of Egypt, Ramesses, was approaching 70 years old. It had been an incredible run. Already, Ramesses had far exceeded his father Seti, his family's patron Horemheb, and pretty much any ruler in recent history. Only Thutmose III, Men-Kheper, had exceeded such a record, reigning 54 years in total. But Thutmose had come to the throne as a child, and the first 2 decades had been a regency under Hatshepsut. Likewise, the distant ancestor Pepi II had reigned over 60 years, maybe, but he too came to power as a child. Ramesses, meanwhile, had been at least 18, probably older, when he took power. From day one, he had exercised authority and led decision-making as a fully fledged ruler. By any metric, therefore, Ramesses had now reigned longer, and with more personal involvement than any pharaoh in history. You have to wonder how that impacted his family, specifically his sons. Over the decades, Ramesses had fathered many, many, many children, but only a few rise above the lists to become known figures with visible titles and roles in government. The most visible are the heirs, men whom we might call the crown princes. During the Ramessid era, the Egyptian royal house did not have a single word or phrase to designate the heir. Instead, they used a cluster of titles to mark out seniority, position in society, and roles within the government. Under Ramesses II, the sons who became crown prince, quote-unquote, tend to share a specific combination of titles. First, they are called Iri-Pat, or member of the elite. That is combined with the title Sa-Nesu Semsu, or eldest son of the king. Eldest here does not mean firstborn, just oldest one still alive. By themselves, these 2 titles are reasonably common, but only certain people have them in combination. Can you guess who? Yeah, the most prominent sons of the king. From that, historians get a basic outline of the succession under Ramesses' long reign. It changed semi-frequently. For the first 3 decades, only one prince had the combination Iri-Pat and Sa-Nesu Semsu. That was Amun-Herkhotep, the son of Nefertari, first surviving male of Ramesses' new lineage. Across multiple monuments, that boy, and he alone, bore that combination of titles, along with others marking him as a general, a priest, and member of royal society. Hypothetically, Amun-Herkhotep should have succeeded his father and become the next king. Unfortunately, he died sometime before year 30. When that happened, power passed to his younger brother, half-brother, I should say. The new crown prince was Ramesses Jr. He was the eldest male child of Queen Iset-Nofret. He was probably born in the days of Seti I, and when Amun-Herkhotep died, Ramesses Jr. may have been in his late 20s or early 30s. Still healthy, still active. He would make a vigorous king when the time came. But it didn't. It seems that Ramesses Jr. was slightly unlucky. He became the heir at a time when his father was still healthy, vigorous, and dominating political affairs. So as far as the monuments go, Prince Ramesses Jr. never got a chance to step into the spotlight. Even the date of his death is terribly uncertain. It may have been quite early, around year 35, but it could have been as late as the early 50s. There is a massive gap in the written record, and historians really can't pinpoint when this prince died. So the tale of Ramesses Jr. simply vanishes into thin air. With the first and second-born sons now dead, power passed to the fourth. We have met him before, the Prince Kha-em-Waset. For nearly 20 years, the Prince Kha-em-Waset, or appearing in Luxor, had been the high priest in the great city of Merneptah, or Memphis. He had overseen massive construction projects, including the start of the Serapeum, the great catacomb of the Apis bulls west of the Step Pyramid. So by the time his elder brother Ramesses Jr. passed to the west, the prince was already well experienced with administrative and religious affairs. As a result, it seems like the transition was relatively smooth. Statues of the prince began to depict him with the supreme titles, and administrative records from this period show him managing affairs in Merneptah. Ka-Mwaset oversaw temple construction, and may have helped demolish some older monuments. More on that another time. He also led rituals for the great gods. Ironically, that included Aten. On one of his funerary statues, now in the Louvre Museum, Prince Ka-Mwaset made offerings to great and powerful deities, and he hoped for a successful journey to the afterlife. Within that text, he invoked the old sun disk that we know so well. Quote, "Hereditary noble, companion of Horus, king's son, Sem priest, Ka-Mwaset, the true of voice. He says, clear your vision so that you may see the Aten, that you may adore it in life. You shall be invoked in Rosetchau, which is the great necropolis of Memphis. You shall traverse the valley. You shall penetrate the secret cavern. You will dwell within the sacred land, just like the crew of mighty ones who are together with Ra." End quote. I mentioned earlier how, while Amarna was deconstructed, and Akhenaten himself erased in many cases, the god he favored remained intact. We've seen this repeatedly in the years after Akhenaten, as kings like Horemheb, Seti, and Ramesses II erected monuments to the great god Ra. They still mentioned and honored the sun disk. Aten was no longer supreme, as Akhenaten had encouraged, nor was he a major player in the pantheon, but the god retained some of his status. He was a meaningful symbol of Ra, and a recognized aspect of the sun's power on earth. Apparently, Aten was still prominent enough that, when looking ahead to his immortality, Ka-Mwaset, son of the man who demolished Amarna, still invoked the luminous qualities of that shining god. It's a good example of how complex the post-Amarna story really is. Sadly, we don't know much about Ka-Mwaset's time as crown prince. It seems that his ascendancy was quite short-lived. Ironically, the clue for that comes from one of Ka-Mwaset's own crowning achievements, the catacombs that we call the Serapeum. In the 6th decade of Ramesses' reign, workers at the Serapeum dug a new chamber for a burial. Lying in a wooden coffin, they interred the mummified remains of something. When excavators opened this chamber in the mid-1800s, they found a mass of bones and resin. It had been wrapped up in a vaguely human shape, and it bore a beautiful gold mask on the head. The mask is now in the Louvre. It doesn't look like your traditional Egyptian mummy mask with the lovely headdress or wig and jewelry. Instead, this mask is a thin piece of gold foil, awkwardly shaped into a human face. The ears stick out prominently to either side. The mask might be a representation of Ka-Mwaset, perhaps in the final years of his life, or even a death mask after his passing. That, unfortunately, is speculative, as is the nature of the mummy on which the mask lay. The mass of bones could be the remains of the prince himself, or it could be an Apis bull, whose body was arranged like a human, perhaps connecting the animal with Osiris, the first mummy. Alas, no one knows. The mass of bones and resin had largely disintegrated by the time excavators found them. The leader of that expedition, Mariette, never compiled his notes or fully published them before he died. And even today, the location of those bones is completely unknown. Just another instance of mid-1800s archaeologists being quite frustrating. At any rate, this burial in the Serapeum is either the last deed of Ka-Mwaset or possibly his own burial. Whichever it was, the burial probably happened in year 55, because the workers constructing this chamber left an inscription on the wall with that particular date. Nearby, a stone stela shows the Apis bull receiving offerings from a prince. Notably though, it is no longer Ka-em-Waset, but instead his younger brother, a son named Merneptah. Upon the stela, we find this prince with titles like King's Eldest Son, Member of the Elite, Supreme General, Royal Scribe. It seems that around year 55, Ka-em-Waset was gone and Merneptah was in charge. The prince surely deserves an epitaph. What should we say? Well, maybe Ka-em-Waset can give his own eulogy. One of his best preserved monuments is a statue, now in the British Museum. It shows the prince as a high-ranking priest of the great god Osiris, and it probably comes originally from Abydos. The statue is lovely, but most people can't read the prayer that is written upon it, which is a shame because it's quite evocative. The prayer reads, quote, "O Atum, may you give breath to the Sem priest and king's son Ka-em-Waset. He has made as his monument his statue for 1,000,000 years to be in Abydos. It is a fitting place for offerings, a sacred necropolis for giving praise to the dead. May it open its way for this effective spirit, even as the site bears the statue of the king's eldest son, Ka-em-Waset. May you grant to him life, stability, and prosperity, he abiding and remaining in your temple. He is your son and your champion." End quote. The statue, standing in a hall of the British Museum, bears this silent testimony to Ka-em-Waset's life. Hopefully, people continue to speak his name, and the first Egyptologist will live forever. If that burial in the Serapeum was not Ka-em-Waset, then where is he? The most likely candidate is a small hill just west of Saqqara. Here, a Japanese excavation has found monuments, including a small chapel devoted to the prince, as well as a tomb belonging to his daughter. Ka-em-Waset might be buried in this area. For now, excavations continue. With the passing of Ka-em-Waset, the fourth son, power now shifted to the 13th, Merneptah, or beloved of Ptah. Like all of the princes after Amun-Herkhotpeshef, Merneptah was the son of Queen Iset-Nofret. She had died when he was very young. For the next 30-odd years, the boy grew to be a man and took part in his father's courtly society. We don't hear much of Merneptah in that time. A few images on temple walls, mainly part of processions. But once he became the crown prince, Merneptah stepped up in a big way. Suddenly, monuments proliferate, recording the prince as king's eldest son and member of the elite, those two supreme titles of the designated heir. He went further than that, though, accumulating a host of roles in government and ceremonial positions. For example, Merneptah began wielding authority as the Kheri-Tep-Tawi, or chief of the two lands, the Imira-Mesha-Wer, the great overseer of troops, or supreme general, the Kherep-Netjeru, or director of the gods, perhaps referring to the priesthoods and divine statues. Finally, he called himself the heir of Ramesses quite explicitly, with titles like Iwa-Geb, the heir of Geb, and Seti-Geb, acting in the place of Geb. This was a reference to the earth god, one of Egypt's first divine kings. The idea seems to be that as Pharaoh Ramesses stepped back from day-to-day business, Merneptah presented his father in the guise of that god, and himself as acting in his father's place, so to speak. In short, Merneptah's monuments go way further than his older brothers, presenting him more and more as the representative of royal authority. He wasn't king or even co-regent, but he had many of the powers of a ruler, wielded on his father's behalf. At this point, we can say without fear of spoilers, Merneptah would be the final crown prince of Ramesses II's reign. When the old king died, this was the son that finally inherited the throne. But that is a story for another day. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Next time, it's the big one. The end of Ramesses II's reign. After more than 60 years on the throne, the ancient king finally reaches his end. We'll look back at his life overall, what he had accomplished, and come face to face with his magnificently preserved mummy. That is our next chapter. Before I go, I would like to thank all of my supporters on patreon.com. In particular, I would like to thank Berry, who joined as an overseer some time ago, but to my great shame, I neglected to thank him directly. Berry, thank you so much for your support. My apologies for the delay, and I hope this makes up for it. I would also like to thank the priests, my top-tier subscribers. These fine folks are so generous with their money, and I am in their debt. Special thanks must go to Mallory, Farron, Andrew, Carlos, Erin, Kate, Erjan, Suyon, Dan, Siyen, Alicia, Karen, Jeffrey, James, Veronica, Dan S., Nadine, Andy and Chelsea, Mycost, Yola, TJ, Terry, Eric, Chris, and Linda. Folks, you are all most generous. May Aten shine continuously upon you and your city. May the Apis bull bring you prosperity, and may you enjoy a fame as everlasting as Ka-Em Waset. To everyone listening, thank you for joining me. I'll see you soon.